So yes, I started mapping Ireland's border quite a few years ago, and it struck me that if I was going to be sort of entitled to map it, then I needed to witness it and see it all firsthand. So that set me off on a kind of a walk uh, along the border. I started east and went west, and looking for things that weren't on any other maps. This was the idea. Um, One of the first things that struck me from pretty much the first day were little crossing points that people had made to go across the border from north to south. A lot of them were like this, small bridges, footbridges, because a lot of the border is water. So I started photographing them. Probably the first time I photographed them, I wasn't even really sure what I was after, but I could tell they were sort of interesting. So I started collecting them. I was photographing all sorts of other things though as well. But gradually, as I moved west, I started realizing that these connections, as I call them, were interesting in themselves. That probably could be a good subject for a map. So then I started hunting them really closely. And it also meant my walk got a lot more difficult, because if you're looking for these connections, you have to stick very close to the border, because many of them are very small. So suddenly, it became something like a performance art sort of project where I really had to be quite close to the line all the time. I wasn't always directly on the line, but I could always see it. I was usually just a field away, maybe. And gradually I started building up these connections that way. And if I quickly flip back to that map, you can see the map connections of the overall finished piece. I've exhibited it sometimes like that version there without the borderline at all. I take away the borderline. And I just replace it with the connections that I found. Although more recently I've put the borderline back into it because it makes the map more readable. I'm sure you can recognize the vague outline of Northern Ireland there. So that was one of them. It was on these before I started the journey, though. I knew I was going to have to face up to the Borders Association with the Troubles and with violence. And before I even started, I thought I was going to start charting structures of the defensive architecture. So I came up with a set of symbols for those, and I charted the location of various castles and forts, and also more recent structures, military structures from the Troubles period, which are gone, in fact. So I had to get the coordinates of those through Freedom of Information requests and various other means, local knowledge as well. Although actually, maybe you can tell from that slide, as I was doing the walk, you started wondering what exactly the architecture of power was, and some things maybe didn't seem so, weren't strictly speaking defensive structures, but they still seem to deserve a place. So like a lighthouse, for example, seems like a kind of a statement about our ability to wrangle nature and to make the world a more safer place for us. So as I moved along, I really found it was very hard to know where to stop, and I'm still not certain where to stop. But these are some of the things that I charted for the most recent version of the map. Put together, they start to look like that. I wanted to, you can see on the top right as well, you can see just south of Caledon a banner symbol, which I started charting protests, which seemed like quite a good, like the Ordnance Survey, for example, charts the sites of battles, famous battles over history, but you'll never get any record of, say, the miners' strike, something like that. So I thought maybe these things should deserve a place as well. So I started charting the location of certain protests as well. Although, of course, they've left no particular physical mark. This map, which features the connections and some of the defensive architecture, went in the book that Emma mentioned there. It's called The Rule of the Land. And if you look up at the top right there, you can see we've got Against Hard Border as a protest. So the last edition of it came out. I was able to add that to the most recent edition of the book. And of course, those were against the imposition of a hard border after Brexit. which so far hasn't happened. So maybe they had, maybe there's a protest had some effect. So this was, as I was making these maps, and these maps were sort of put together over several years, this naturally made me very interested in the kind of work that other independent cartographers were doing. And this is where we get to the part for curators, because I had to go at being a curator. And I'm sorry for people who are trained professional curators. You probably think I'm a terrible amateur, but I felt I was. I felt I was getting into that space when I came up with this exhibition, Mapping Alternative Ulster. It took me a while to figure out that I was a curator. I just basically was seeing maps that I thought were important and had something to say. And in that as well, are often quite beautiful. And I thought, we need to put these in a room so people can see them. And I suppose that's the curatorial urge. So I went looking for all these map makers and across Northern Ireland. And as you can see, it's a mapping alternative Ulster. So there's also a couple of counties in the south of Ireland as well included. Primarily, I was looking for maps that were going to contradict this kind of image. Here's a map that was published in the Irish Times 5 or 6 years ago about religious population, the religions of the population of Northern Ireland, distribution of faith in Northern Ireland. And it's such an unfortunate way to look at a place, rather staid, rather cliched, and inaccurate also, because the colors they're using are political colors, green and orange, have political import. And this presumption that a person's religion tells you how they vote has ceased to be true. So I thought that Northern Ireland was getting kind of mistreated by maps, and I wanted to find some alternative voices. However, the maps in the show are still political. That was sort of important. We saw earlier Stephen Walker's Brexit Land, which I think is wonderful. But it strikes me he's sort of using maps. He's using the idea of a map to make a kind of a comment, whereas the maps I wanted were slightly, they actually are maps. You know, you could actually use them to find your way around the area that they cover, but they will draw your attention to different things. Like my own map showing you where significant protests occurred. They still chart things correctly, but they are concerned with different things. They have a different kind of grammar. And as you can see from that photo from the show, they're actually pretty traditional. You know, they're all in frames. They're all on the wall. They aren't maps as metaphor, and they aren't some sort of postmodern hijacking of cartography. They are actually people practicing cartography to the extent that some of them didn't even realize that they were sort of producing art as well. I'll show you a few examples. This one, oh, that's not a very good quality slide. This was 1976 with John Carson, Belfast Friend map. So as you can see, he's got an ordinary Ordnance Survey map of Belfast. And then he went around and he photographed all his friends and he stuck their pictures on the map. And then he drew lines connecting where people who know each other, all the friendships. And they all lead to him because they're all his friends, but then some of them are friends of each other also. So there's interconnecting lines also. Very beautiful, simple idea. Seems to predict Facebook or something. But this is also 1976, which was one of the bloodiest years of the Troubles, especially in Belfast. So it was also about, tells a different story from the one that people would have seen in the news. It actually says something about how people are actually living, you know. So I thought that was beautiful. I wanted that one. On a similar front, I really love Benny Sweeney's Belfast Underground. This is a recent map, 2018, where he's imagined a Belfast sort of tube system. Belfast, as you may know, doesn't have one. It doesn't even have a very good bus system, frankly. So what he's done here is imagine an underground for Belfast, and he's connected up the city. Now, Benny here as well, he thought, it's kind of funny, this map's quite funny, and I think the artist himself was sort of content with that, but I think there's a real poignancy to it, because Belfast is actually still quite a broken up city. We still have peace walls, for example. And there's only maybe, off the top of my head, maybe 4 bridges across the Lagan through the centre of Belfast. So you have a city that hasn't quite got netted up the way many modern cities are. Still not yet. So in this map, you see what's possible, what could be, and I think there's something really wonderful about that. Here's another one put together by a team of architects called Forum for Alternative Belfast. They were mapping brownfield sites in Belfast, and here you see maps used as a kind of lobbying tool, helping people to understand where there are improvements to be made in the city. I would say when I was looking for artists for this show, I'd say there were broadly 2 sorts. You had ones like Forum for Alternative Belfast, who were mostly quite urban. They had an awareness, like maybe they'd be connected with universities, so they had quite a good critical awareness of what they were doing and where it fitted, maybe even a global context. They'd be influenced by other types of practitioners from around the world. So you had that sort. And then you had the sort which were often older. They were more concerned with conservation. They were rural, and they were just like drawing maps at their kitchen table. And they had no real sense of audience, really. They might just show the maps in the local library or something like this. And they were hard to find, very difficult to find. A lot of them don't even have email, but you got to go physically look for them. And I have to admit, they were my favorites. I like those ones, although they had presented their own challenges. So Johnny Mckegney, for example, producing these sort of folk maps of his neighborhood in Fermanagh, around his home village of Tempo. Years and years and years producing these maps. There are hundreds of them. Getting to know his neighborhood with such intense detail. It's quite extraordinary. I loved his work. Unfortunately, I didn't get to meet him because he died not long before I became aware of his work. But I went down there and I met his widow, and she let me into his studio. And she told me that his parents had died quite young, Johnny Mckegney, and she thinks he felt he'd missed out on knowing stuff about his family history because of that. And so she felt, in some sense, this whole project was kind of compensate for that, this obsessive seeking of information and recording of information about his locality. On a similar vein, we have, this is just a detail, map of Bunglass, which is West Coast, County Donegal, near where I'm from, actually. And here, the cartographer Dan Mckegney had loads of meetings, big community hall meetings with just all the old people from the neighborhood. And they got them in together and they wrote down all the place names of just everything, every place name they had for their neighborhood. So every townland, of course, but more than that, every bend in the road, every pile of rocks, everything that had a name, which in Ireland was actually most things. And it's such a huge project. Most of these names, of course, wouldn't have been written down before. People only would have spoken of them. They wouldn't have had to have written them down. But what was concerning Dan Mckegney was the fact that these names are disappearing because the generation that used them was dying off. And indeed, everyone who helped make this map is now dead. This is from the mid 1990s. And so we still have these names thanks to this map. He's caught them just before they disappeared. And of course, it's interesting to reflect on it, really. The reason why they had names is because this is a very closely worked landscape. People are out across it every day. Say sheep farmers, for example, fishermen down on the cliffs. Whereas now the landscape hasn't worked really anymore. So not that closely, at least. So these names are falling away because they don't need names anymore. You don't need to know the name of those rocks anymore because you're never going to tell somebody to meet you there. So it isn't just a record of places then, it's a record of a kind of a way of seeing the landscape. It's a record of how we used to live. So that was Mapping Alternative Ulster. I just showed you, I think I showed you maybe 5 maps there. There was about 20 in the show. And I still pick them up whenever I can. I've got quite a big collection at this stage. But I haven't run it in a couple of years. I ran it in 3 locations, in the Ulster Museum and then in 2 art centres in Northern Ireland. It was probably through that then that these folks got to speaking to me. Making the Future, which is a public arts organization, and they asked me to do a project with them just recently. Something to do with maps, and it was very open what it was, but they had another artist, Lindsay McDougall, who wanted to work with dyeing threads and using stitching as a form of expression. So we came up with something. We came up with something to help us draw a project together. And we took this as a starting point, which is from the Ulster Museum's collection, which is a hand-stitched map from the early 19th century. And so I met this is all done online, of course. This was done in the Zoom meetings. And I showed them this map and several others. And we talked about the idea of stitching maps. And then they went off and did their work. And it was quite a good project, I think, for times of COVID, because it was a solo operation, but yet it got people out into the landscape as well. They were all sent these kits. And most of the threads they were sent were white, because the first thing they had to do was dye their threads to make the colors they wanted to use, which is a wonderful thing if you're mapping your neighborhood and you actually get your raw materials from your neighborhood. So people went out and they found berries or grasses or other plants, and they got stewing them, and they made colors. There's about 25 people doing this, and we'd have these meetups online, and we had a kind of it's called Slack, which is sort of like WhatsApp, and they'd be sharing photographs and videos of one another and chatting about the work that they were doing. And gradually, people started building up their selections of colors, and some of the work I thought was just beautiful. So here we got a woman who mapped the fields around where she lived and where her father just died, as she says there. And it ends up being a kind of a map and a portrait and something very visceral about it. Then this man, John Brennan, mapped Belfast, and he used the threads to draw out the forgotten rivers, but there's quite a few rivers under Belfast that have been covered over, and so he used his threads to follow the routes of these rivers that are underneath the city centre. So I was very impressed with the work, and like I said, I thought it was a good response to workshopping when you can't get everyone together in a workshop. That there was something about the fact that they had to go out and explore their neighborhoods. So they got them out into the world while at the same time acknowledging the fact that we couldn't operate it in the normal way. So
I'm just aware of time.
Oh, that's fine. So that's the last thing I got for you, really. I just got that we're making the future. We're just going to do this thing next. So I really enjoyed Alison's talk about ruins, because that's what they got me doing next. We're going to write about some ruins. And that's it, folks. That's what I'm doing. Thank you very much for listening.